Hi everyone, okay, it's time for another instructive game from Garry Kasparov. In this game he had the black pieces against Florin Gheorghiu, who is the best Romanian chess player of all time, and who opened the game with d4. So, play then continued, knight f6, c4 and g6, which is going into the King's Indian defense, a favorite of Kasparov's. And this game went into the Simish variation, after knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, and f3. Gheorghiu often used this variation in the King's Indian defense and had great success playing f3 against the Nimzo-Indian throughout his career, so much so that it's often called the Gheorghiu variation. And play in this game continued with the book line of black castling, and then bishop e3, e5, d5, and c6, immediately challenging white's center in typical King's Indian style. So queen d2, c takes d5, c takes d5, knight b d7, knight g e2, still book moves, a6, knight c1, knight h5, and bishop d3, which is the last book move, and normal here is knight f4. But Kasparov played instead, after bishop d3, f5, again striking at white's center in typical King's Indian defense style. So, knight 1 e2, knight df6, e takes f5, g takes f5, knight g3, and e4, which is the key instructive move of this game. It's a space gaining and positional pawn sacrifice. Such sacrifices have become commonplace at top level play these days, especially in the King's Indian and Benoni defense setups, but 50 or 60 years ago they were practically unheard of. And the main point in this instance is to unleash the bishop on g7, because white almost always castles queenside in the Samish King's Indian. And pushing the pawn forward also allows black to use e5 as an outpost square for his pieces, which Kasparov does to great effect later in the game. Play then continued with knight takes h5, knight takes h5, f takes e4, and f4. And pushing the pawn instead of capturing here again is commonplace in modern play. It results in some good initiative for black, especially considering that white is still not castled. The pawn can be regained instead with bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and f takes e4, but black will sorely regret exchanging off his dark squared bishop, because this bishop here on e3 is going to be a real menace. And in this position white can't recapture on e4, because if bishop takes e4 then there's a tactic queen h4 check, king d1, and queen takes e4. So f4 anyway. And then Gheorghiu played bishop f2, and then came bishop g4, which is preventing white from castling queenside as he wants to do, and provoking the weakening move h3. An interesting alternative is bishop e2, bishop takes e2, queen takes e2, and f3, which is sacrificing a second pawn for further dark square control, with the following moves: g takes f3 and knight f4. And a sample continuation here goes queen d2, knight g2 check, king f1, knight h4, bishop takes h4, queen takes h4, king e2, rook takes f3, king takes f3, and rook f8 check, with a strong attack for black. So h3, bishop d7, Gheorghiu castle queenside, and now bishop e5, which is making use of the outpost square and setting up queen f6 with strong pressure down this long diagonal towards the white king. So Gheorghiu spent a move getting his king off the open file. Good idea. Now queen f6, bishop e2, and knight g3, which is a key move in Kasparov's attack, and only possible because h3 has been provoked. And at this stage, as compensation for his pawn, black now has a strong grip on the position. Gheorghiu has no useful pawn moves, and black's pressure on the long diagonal will prove decisive. And white's best option here is what Gheorghiu played with bishop takes g3, which could be called slightly controversial, as it's giving up not only the bishop pair, but his important dark squared bishop, given the nature of the position. black is going to have very good dark square control now. But other moves gave black easy equality, even taking into account the sacrifice pawn. So f takes g3 and bishop f3. And at this stage, again taking the sac pawn into account, the chances are about equal for both sides. But as usual with Kasparov, the pressure he applies is too much for his opponent to deal with, and Gheorghiu later crumbles. Rook ac8 is what Kasparov played now. And then came knight e2 from Gheorghiu, which is beginning a reorganization of his pieces. Now came queen g6, which is apparently to overprotect the pawn on g3, but stronger here was playing instead rook c5, because although he'll play this move soon, playing it now would restrict white's defensive chances. After queen g6 Gheorghiu played rook c1, and if Kasparov had played rook c5 the move before, he could now double rooks on the c-file and have good control of it, because of the pressure that's going to be raining down on b2, as you'll see as the game continues. So rook takes c1 and queen takes c1, which seems strange because it allows rook c8 with tempo, which is what Kasparov played. Excuse me. But if instead rook c1, then bishop takes h3 can be played, regaining the sacrifice pawn with a good position. If g takes h3, then rook takes f3 with advantage to black. So queen takes c1, and now rook c8 and queen e3 from Gheorghiu, which wasn't the best square for the queen because now white loses the tempo after queen f6 and queen d2 in order to protect b2. Playing b3 instead is just too dangerously weakening to consider. So queen d2 and rook c5, and now black is starting to get a much better position, and white still can't bring his rook into the fray because of the bishop takes h3 tactic, and g-pawn is the only piece or pawn whatever defending the bishop on f3. And black has the bishop pair here and they're starting to look very strong. So knight c1 is what Gheorghiu played now, aiming for knight d3 in order to get rid of black's dangerous dark squared bishop, but this is a passive move, effectively a blunder, and Kasparov punishes it well. First he played bishop f4, then came queen b4, which is the best square for the queen because it comes with tempo as threatening to take on b7. So bishop b5, and now knight b3 from Gheorghiu, which is another bad move, and the pressure is proving too much. He must have been hoping to evict the rook from this good outpost on c5, and seemingly it can't move up the board because all these squares are covered. But his knight moving from c1 has moved from its defense of d3. So now comes bishop d3 check, king a1, and now the very strong rook c2 with a rook on the 7th, and suddenly black has a big advantage in every continuation. And to make matters worse, Gheorghiu now blundered with the rook b1, and it's understandable that he wants to overprotect b2, but a better defense here was knight d4, whereafter with best play rook c4, queen takes b7, rook takes d4, and rook d1. Black still has a sizable advantage, about 1.5 pawns, but it's nowhere near as much as in the game continuation, which after rook b1 it's about 4 pawns. So Kasparov now played bishop e5 with a third attacker on b2, and now white is effectively helpless. Gheorghiu tried knight c1, but now it's a forced mate in 4 that Kasparov found. And well, the game was really lost in any case. Like, Gheorghiu really should have resigned after rook c2, because now came the mating attack with a winning sacrifice. Bishop takes b2 check, and queen takes b2 because it delays the mate for as long as possible. Presumably Gheorghiu hadn't seen he was going to be mated now, he probably would have resigned. If instead rook takes b2, now comes rook takes c1, and it's mate because the rook is pinned by the queen. So queen takes b2, and now queen takes b2 check, and Gheorghiu resigned, seeing finally that there was no escape. His only move is rook takes b2, but now rook takes c1, rook b1, and rook takes b1 is mate. So, another great game from Garry Kasparov with a very creative pawn sacrifice. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave any comments or thoughts. Thanks very much.